Hello Internet, welcome back to Tromsø Twilight, the channel where I, Vincent, talk to you, the cosmos, about books, movies, music I find interesting, that I enjoy, or a combination of the two. And today we're going to be talking about this recent John Zorn record, Fantasma, Illusions from a Surrealist Mirror. John Zorn is a super prolific composer and musician, known for playing in the avant-garde experimental rock band Naked City, for which he was the composer. He also has an album that's very respected from the 80s called Spillane, that where it was composed by writing music on index cards, or writing instructions to musicians on index cards that were then kind of seen to be like blocks of music. He very often writes in like short blocks of music within the same composition, and he uses styles from right across the musical spectrum. I really like Spillane. I really like a record that he made with Mike Patton called Moonchild, that was very, very noisy, kind of experimental rock improvisations where Zorn wasn't playing, he was just conducting. He has a lot of really interesting albums, way too many to get into, and I don't know a lot of them. So I'm now migrating over from Spotify because the CEO of Spotify seems to think that Terminator was an aspirational movie and wants to bring it into reality by investing 600 million in military AI. So I've been moving over to a new streaming service and looking up artists that I used to listen to, trying to kind of orient myself. And I discovered that okay, John Zorn has a quite recent new album out. It's one of a series of records which are he has scored extremely complex virtuosic music for classically trained musicians and combined it with improvisers like from a jazz background, and creating this weird hybrid of like jazz and neoclassical, or sorry, more contemporary classical musical styles. I listened to this album and I really loved it, and I wanted to talk about it with you. Zorn is not playing on it, it's his compositions. The musicians are a bass player called Jorge Roeder, um, Chess Smith on the drums, Stephen Gosling on the piano, and Hashimoto Sai on vibraphone and percussion. Uh, there's also a guest that I'll get to later. So I'm going to try and describe these very strange and beautiful compositions to you. The album begins with three tracks that are all based around Paradise Regained, the Milton poem. I've only read Paradise Lost. Paradise Regained apparently is about the temptation of Christ. So the album opens with this kind of jazz music based around the vibraphone and the drums and the bass, and they are playing in they're playing a bar of three, a bar of two, and a bar of three. So they're kind of moving back and forth between these time signatures. Beautiful bass playing. Vibraphone is very central in the sound, and then they move into a section where the time signature is four and then two, four and then two, and then suddenly it kind of collapses into this break, which is almost like a sort of Frank Zappa like series of notes. Then four and two, four, two, again a kind of Frank Zappa esque series of notes, and then into a drum improvisation. As it goes on, there are other time signatures, um, and then moving between those and see a series of sections that are almost like uh, classical music that is almost like not exactly atonal, but difficult to know what key it's in, quite unpredictable. And this is your opening track, so it kind of sets the scene where it's moving between things that are more recognizably kind of in an avant-garde jazz style, and then these series of very fast notes and rhythms. But then Paradise Regained 2 is totally different. It opens with this very cool, slow, kind of noir jazz sound that might remind you of Buran and the Club of Gore, if you know them. Doom jazz, brushes playing, a melodic double bass, super beautiful melodies. The lead instrument is the bass on this song, and I'm like a sucker for melodic upright bass. Then the vibraphone is creating a kind of harmonic bed throughout the track with these chords that it's playing, while the bass is able to play this kind of beautiful, almost lullaby type melody. This is the only track that is in this style. It's the most accessible and it's so gorgeous. I'm going to put it in the description. Paradise Regained 3. It opens with a much more hectic style. It's like funky jazz drumming with a bass riff. Again, they've gone back to this a bar of four, a bar of two, a bar of four, a bar of two, and this goes on for about 1 minute before it breaks into this total free jazz for like a short section. And then from this free jazz over into what is very clearly an extremely complex scored avant-garde classical section where you can hear from the way that the musicians are playing together that they know exactly where all the hits are going to be. And then at 1 minute 45 approximately, it breaks into a drum solo followed by a short silence. And then when it comes back, it has this kind of creeping spacey section with the vibraphone really like again creating these beautiful weird chords. It really reminds me this part of like a 60s sci-fi soundtrack. At 3 minutes, the vibraphone starts playing this kind of descending scale repeatedly while the drums and the bass do all this crazy wild improvisation underneath. And then after about 30 seconds of that, it goes into this extremely hectic section, which again has some repeated phrases that are definitely scored, and then it ends on a drum break. What I mean, from track 2 to track 3, so from this beautiful to this extremely exhilarating complex track. Track 4 is kind of maybe like the center of the record, and this is a track called L'Antitete, maybe? L'Entité. My French is terrible. Let's say that this is called L'Entité, which maybe the antithesis, I don't know. But I Googled it quickly and it seems to be a Miro painting. It's 10 minutes long. This is sonically the most challenging track on the record. It starts with some jazz phrases that kind of put me in mind of like, you know, Paris in the Surrealist era, but then it goes over into atonal classical phrases, but the piano and the percussion playing on the same beats, you know, some really discordant piano. And then it seems to be like that there are some long sections where you can't tell what the time signature is. It reminds me of sometimes when you see people playing contemporary classical music, and I sit there thinking like, how are they reading it? Like, how do they know what the measures are? Because it's just you can't follow it. Some really harsh hits from like on the drums and cymbals, kind of really abstract. Like I can understand why it has this title like an abstract painting. And then in the middle, there's this really kind of still section suddenly where the pianist plays all the strings up the piano and just lets it kind of hang in the air. And then there's this wild jazz with like a walk-in bass and the drums are like banging and the pianist is just playing the same chord over the top of this jazz ensemble. Like the bass player and the drummer are like really going at it, playing like walking bass, like fast bebop jazz, and the pianist just hitting the same chord over the top, like a color. It really reminds me of a color. Seems to be an improv section after that, and there's like some slamming on the keys and a jazz section, like a sort of post bop. Reminds me of Thelonious Monk. Reminds me of Ornette Coleman. And then there are some moments of like just total abstraction and weirdness thrown in. And then later you have the piano coming back with this playing a single chord over the rest of the band's improvisation, which kind of again reminds me of a color. It's like higher up on the octave. There's a drum solo, and then towards the end there's like some more soft chords, and the piano and the bass player is like playing slides on the bass. There's a really lively section where everybody's just going nuts towards the end, and then the piano is playing like this very short repetitive pattern very fast, and it sounds like the drum kit is just like rolling down the stairs, and then it resolves on this quite a soft and beautiful note. At this point there are only 2 tracks left of this album. The next one is called The Philosophy of Weightlessness, and this is much more abstract than the ones that came before it. It has Ikue Mori or Mori Ikue. I don't know which way around it is most respectful to say this person's name, but this person is making some kind of like electronic noises through the whole track. And this is the kind of, I don't really know how these types of electronic sounds are generated, but it's like you sometimes hear this in avant-garde jazz, like electronics that are not in any way melodic. It's all sound play. And while this is going on, the vibraphone is playing all of these like suspended chords with some space between them, and the drums are just improvising behind in a kind of not particularly rhythmic way that's much more about like mood with occasional quite harsh stabs. It's all very abstract, and at times it reminds me of like the music for a documentary about space. They could be floating around in the cosmos, but at other times it's too intense for that analogy. After about 5 minutes, there's a fast repetitive phrase introduced, and there's a much more hectic section, and it sort of this resolves again into something similar to the beginning. And then towards the end, there's this like really nice rhythmic drum pattern and chords on the vibraphone over the top. I almost would have liked this section to be longer because it was such a relief when the drums came in and started playing this like pattern. But a very similar pattern comes back in the following song. I feel like this composition, The Philosophy of Weightlessness, is the kind of piece of music that will surprise you every time you listen to it because it's so abstract that it's not really possible for you to hold it in your mind in its entirety. It's like new every time you hear it. It's like going on a journey. And the last track is called Terra Firma, Terra Incognita, which I haven't looked up, but I think that means solid land, unknown land. The beginning of this track is quite similar to the previous track, but slightly more hectic, and it has a piano as well as a vibraphone. And then it goes into like this series of like very short compositional sections, which is quite a kind of typical John Zorn technique. I read once that he was influenced by the music of the Looney Tunes cartoons. So there are bits, where like the pianist is smashing keys, and then there's like a repeated drum pattern, repeated phrase on the piano. Then there's like a chunk of everybody improvising really fast, and then there's a drum solo. At around 2.5 minutes, suddenly like everything is suspended in space, which again is a bit like gives you this sense of like sci-fi. It's all really abstract and spacey, and I think about this kind of terra firma, terra incognito. It almost reminds me of like maybe people traveling in space, finding a new country, or maybe even like, people discovering the new world and everything is like alien. Or another kind of metaphor that came to mind while I was listening to it is like the beginning of life on Earth, like the first protozoan creatures finding land and like kind of developing. Further along in the track, there's some really nice interplay with the piano and the vibraphone where they'll be doing quite complex melodies, and one of them will start the melody shortly after the other one and they'll play the same melody, but then they'll end together, and it does it several times. It's almost like not quite a fugue technique, but similar. And also reminded me of this title of the album about the Surrealist Mirror. It's like one of them is kind of like a reflection of the other one or something. Um, this track is quite harmonically challenging at times, and it's got some really aggressive drumming on it. But what's great about it is it's like really not disturbing or frightening. It's just like exhilarating. There's this wild drum solo towards the end. There's like mostly on the toms and the cymbals, and then it gets like more and more gentle, but it continues to be the same speed. It's such a weird, almost like dissociative experience. And then there's this like spacey exploratory section with the vibes and the piano and some tuned percussion, and then there's a timpani, or like, is it a timpani or is it like a huge gong creating this like massive sound underneath? And then the track ends with the sound of a bell, and then there's silence, and that's the end of the record. And if you're like me, you probably are like, what the fuck was that? And you put it on again. This was my description of the recent John Zorn album that came out this year. I really, really love it. It's going to be probably in my top albums of the year. I'm hoping to do a list at the end of the year, and I'm pretty sure this will be on it. Have you heard it? Did you like it? What do you think about John Zorn? And did this make you think of any other music that you enjoy? And if so, let me know what it is. I'd love to listen to it. I am always looking out for recommendations. Thanks for listening. Hopefully see you again.